What happens when an F1 team just steals another team's car? Like, not a few parts, not some inspiration. They straight up copied the championship winning Mercedes, and somehow it was legal. This is the story of the pink Mercedes. How they copied a car, survived the controversy, and pulled off one of the greatest comeback wins in F1 history. So picture this. It is 2018. Racing Point, well, they were Force India back then. They'd been this scrappy midfield team for years, always punching above their weight, but never quite breaking through. Then Lawrence Stroll shows up with his checkbook and buys the whole operation. Finally, they've got money. Real money. Actual resources to build a proper car. But here's where it gets interesting. Their technical director, Andrew Green, had spent years working with limited resources. The team was competitive in the midfield, but they knew they weren't attacking the fundamental limitations that kept them from breaking through to the front of the grid. After years of punching above their weight, the team decided to try something completely new. But, and this is crucial, there's a problem. The takeover happened too late. The 2019 car was already designed, and with the regulations changing for 2021, they basically had one shot. 1 year to make something work before starting from scratch again. Think about that. You finally have the money to compete, but you've only got one season to prove it before everything changes. What do you do? Well, Racing Point looked at the Mercedes, the team that was dominating F1, winning everything, and they thought, what if we just took their car? Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, isn't that illegal? We'll get onto that, trust me. Because what Racing Point did next was absolutely genius and incredibly controversial. So they couldn't just copy-paste the Mercedes design, right? F1 doesn't work like that. They had to understand how it all worked together, the philosophy behind it. And this gets technical, but it's important. Racing Point was already using some Mercedes parts, the gearbox for example. For 2020, they were taking the Mercedes suspension and transmission too. But here's the thing, those parts were designed for Mercedes car, not Racing Point's. See, Mercedes built their cars with what's called a low rake philosophy, running their cars nearly parallel to the ground, generating downforce primarily from the floor and diffuser. Racing Point had been running high rake, nose low, rear high, which generates downforce differently through the rear of the car. These are fundamentally incompatible philosophies. You can't just bolt on Mercedes low rake suspension onto a high rake concept and expect it to work. Completely different aerodynamic approach, completely different way of generating downforce. Imagine if you're driving a front wheel drive car your whole life and suddenly you switch to a rear wheel drive. Everything you know about that balance, out of the window. Racing Point had to rebuild the entire car around the Mercedes philosophy. They tested every component, ironically at the Mercedes wind tunnel at Brackley, and figured out how it all worked together. If they got this wrong, they'd be slower than 2019. All the money, all the effort, wasted. The pressure was insane, but they pulled it off. They built the car and they knew they had something special. Pre-season testing in Barcelona was coming up February 2020, and Racing Point was about to shock the entire paddock. February 17th, 2020, Racing Point reveals the livery. 2 days later, Barcelona. The car hits the track for the first time. And Andrew Green, he drops this little hint beforehand. He says, we've applied everything we've learned, combined with what we've seen, adopted by some of our competitors. Some of our competitors. That's the code. That's basically him saying, wait until you see this. The car rolls out, and immediately, people lose their minds. Günther Steiner from Haas, he's furious, accuses them of hypocrisy, because Racing Point had criticized Haas for taking Ferrari parts years earlier. He says, sometimes you have to think before you talk. Maybe one day it's your turn. And when you compare the two cars side by side, you can see why everyone was so shocked. The 2019 Mercedes and the 2020 Racing Point, they're nearly identical. The front wing has the same complicated design, the narrower nose, completely different from Racing Point's 2019 car. The rake is drastically lower, just like Mercedes. The brake ducts were the exact same. The 2019 Racing Point looked nothing like this. This was a completely different car. Then, Checo Perez goes out on track, first day of testing. Third fastest, just 62 thousandths of a second behind Valtteri Bottas in the actual Mercedes. 62 thousandths on day one. Everyone knew something was up. They called it the pink Mercedes. Some people called Racing Point Tracing Point. The other teams were furious. They started claiming it was illegal, that Racing Point had stolen Mercedes' intellectual property. But here's where it gets really interesting. Were they actually right? In F1, there's a rule that dates back to 1981. Article 22.3 of the sporting regulations prohibits teams from using another team's intellectual property, their designs, their data. It's been a cornerstone of the competitive integrity for 40 years. Simple? Well, not exactly. Because Racing Point didn't copy the entire car. There were differences. The inner workings of the suspension, different. Front brake drums, different. Cooling structures, their own design. And Racing Point's defense was this: we only took pictures. We didn't steal any data or designs. We just looked at what Mercedes was doing and figured it out ourselves. Which technically isn't illegal. Teams take inspiration from each other all the time. Haas worked closely with Ferrari, and AlphaTauri, Red Bull's sister team, shared a ton with Red Bull. But this felt different. Why? Because Haas and AlphaTauri weren't threatening anyone. They weren't going to challenge for podiums. They had their place in order. Racing Point, they could actually move up, way up. And that's what scared the teams like Renault and McLaren. One of the midfield teams was about to break away and challenge them for top 3 finishes. That meant less prize money, less prestige. So the Australian Grand Prix arrives. Melbourne, March 2020. Everyone's eager to see if the pink Mercedes is actually fast. But they never found out. The race got cancelled. COVID-19 shut down the entire world. Formula 1 wouldn't race again until July. And by then, things were about to explode. Austria, July 2020, F1 is back. And Racing Point is about to prove everyone wrong. First qualifying session of the season, Bottas takes pole. He's 74 thousandths of a second faster than Charles Leclerc's 2019 pole time. The front of the grid was pretty much the same pace, but Racing Point was completely different. 2019, both cars eliminated in Q1, nowhere. 2020, both cars in top 10. Perez almost a full second faster than his 2019 time. It worked. The pink Mercedes actually worked. Perez finished 6th in the race. Stroll retired with an engine failure, but the pace was there. The next 2 races, both Racing Point cars in the top 7. Then the British Grand Prix happens. Perez tests positive for COVID. Nico Hülkenberg replaces him. Qualifies 3rd, but can't start due to mechanical issues. Bad weekend, right? It was about to get much worse. Because Racing Point's rivals, they'd seen enough. Renault protested 3 times. Styrian Grand Prix, Hungarian Grand Prix, British Grand Prix. Their target, brake ducts. See, those brake ducts were identical to the Mercedes. And Renault found something interesting. Racing Point bought those brake ducts from Mercedes at the end of 2019, when buying those specific parts was still legal. But for 2020, the rules changed. You couldn't buy them anymore. You had to design them yourself. Racing Point kept using them anyway. And after their 3rd protest at Silverstone, the FIA agreed with Renault. The punishment, €400,000 fine and 15 Constructors' Championship points deducted. To put that into perspective, that's the difference between finishing 11th and finishing on the podium. Between millions in prize money and missing out entirely. 15 points. Now, Racing Point were allowed to keep the brake ducts for the rest of the season because redesigning them mid-year would have been impossible. But the damage was done. Other teams appealed for stronger penalties. Racing Point appealed to have the penalties reduced. Eventually, both sides withdrew their appeals. But the relationships were destroyed. Lawrence Stroll, the team owner, who barely speaks publicly, came out and said, "I've never cheated at anything in my life." The FIA's ruling was specific. The overall car design was legal, Racing Point had violated the regulations on the brake duct specifically, but everything else felt within the existing framework. For 2021, the FIA introduced new regulations around quote-unquote listed parts, components that must be designed in-house and cannot be sourced from competitors. The loophole was closed. But for 2020, Racing Point could keep racing. The question remained, did they break the rules or did they just find a loophole? Either way, they had to prove that it was worth it. So, did the gamble work? 2019, 73 points. 7th in the championships, 0 podiums. 2020 was a completely different story. Turkey, Lance Stroll takes pole position in the rain, beating everyone. The race itself was absolute chaos. Wet conditions, car spinning everywhere. Stroll damaged his front wing early and finished outside of the points. Just getting pole in those conditions was huge. Then comes Sakir, Sergio Perez. He just lost his seat for 2021 to Sebastian Vettel. No drive lined up for next year. Week before, engine failure while running in a podium position. He's frustrated, uncertain about his future. This might be one of his last chances to prove himself. He starts 5th on the grid. Lap 1, turn 4. Charles Leclerc hits him. Perez spins, drops the last place, P20. It's over, right? Wrong. Perez fights back. Incredible time management. Perfect pace. He's carving through the field. Then Mercedes messes up their pit stops under a late safety car. Double mistake. Wrong tyres on George Russell. Bottas had a nightmare stop. Racing Point makes a call. Don't pit. Stay out. Perez inherits the lead and he holds it. 190 races. 190 starts without a win. The longest wait for a maiden victory in Formula 1 history. He wins by over 10 seconds. First Mexican Grand Prix winner since 1970 and Racing Point's first win under any name since 1998. And Lance Stroll finishes 3rd. Double podium. Perez is emotional. The team is going crazy against all the odds. From last to first, he did it. And that win, it got him the Red Bull seat for 2021. '20 season final standings, Racing Point finished 4th, 195 points. Multiple podiums, 1 win, 1 pole position. Compared to 2019, it was a massive improvement. But here's the thing, that hurts. They finished 4th, McLaren was 3rd by 7 points. Remember that 15-point penalty for the brake ducts? Without that penalty, Racing Point would have finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. 3rd place pays more prize money. A lot more. It's estimated Racing Point lost millions by missing out on 3rd. Millions because of the brake ducts that should have been caught in the rule changes from 2019 to 2020. And they haven't reached that 4th place since. The team's now called Aston Martin and they've been struggling. That 2020 season, that was their shot. Their one chance with that design before the regulations changed. And they almost pulled it off. So, did Racing Point steal an F1 car? They found a grey area, used parts they were allowed to have, took photos, rebuilt the philosophy from scratch. The gamble paid off. They challenged for 3rd, won a race. Proved that sometimes the fastest way forward isn't innovation, it is smart copying. The FIA closed the loophole for 2021, but for one reason, Racing Point shocked the F1 world.